You've seen things, you've seen patterns, you've made observations. You use inductive reasoning to make some kind of educated guess. Deductive reasoning, this is like what the proofs were about yesterday in the class before, where you're using more of your logical thinking skills and you're seeing statements and definitions and things that are more concrete. Okay, so today we're looking at two rules of logic, and they have a strange name. We have the law of detachment and we have the law of syllogism. Has somewhere in your past somebody told you to mind your P's and Q's?
Yes.
This has to do with rules of logic. So if I said, if you misbehave, then you're going to get in trouble. You misbehave. What happens?
You get in trouble.
That is the law of detachment. P is the if part. It's the hypothesis. If you misbehave. Q is the then part. It's the conclusion. Then you're going to get in trouble. P happened, which means you misbehaved. And these three little dots mean therefore. Therefore, Q's going to happen. You're going to get in trouble. So that example I just gave you is the law of detachment. So when people tell you to mind your P's and Q's, that's what they really mean. If you misbehave, you're going to get in trouble. You misbehave, you get in trouble. So an example I have here says if a student gets an A on a final exam, then the student will pass the class. Colton gets an A on the final exam, therefore, he'll pass the class. So I want to show you how to mark this with your P's and Q's, just so you can see that in case it's helpful. But some of you will just be able to read through this and it should make sense. Okay, so one more time. P is the if part, the hypothesis, and Q is the then part, the conclusion. So let's look at this example over here. If a student gets an A on a final exam, that's the P, the hypothesis. Then the student will pass the class. The then is the conclusion. That's the Q. And then when it says that Colton gets an A on the final exam, which one talks about getting an A on the final exam, P or Q? So I'm back to P again. And then this therefore he'll pass the class. Which one talked about him passing the class? Q. So I'm back to Q. This is the law of detachment, which talks about if P happens, Q's going to happen. P happened, therefore Q's going to happen. Like if I said to you, if I run this paper across my finger, I'm going to get a paper cut. I run the paper across my finger, therefore, I get a paper cut. That's the law of detachment. That's what it means. Okay, law of syllogism. This is like that transitive property. Do you remember how the transitive property talked about if a first thing happens, then the second thing happens, and if that same second thing happens, a third thing happens, so that means the first and the third?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to read this example, and then I'm going to talk about P's and Q's. So it says, if it rains, Emily stays inside. If Emily stays inside, then she doesn't get wet. Therefore, if it rains, she doesn't get wet. So it says if it rains, she stays inside. And if she stays inside, she doesn't get wet. So that means if the first thing happens, it rains, then the last thing happens, she's not going to get wet. So
that makes sense.
P is still the if, Q is still the then. It's just if I have more than one then, I have to give it a different letter. So I want to show you the P, the Q, and the R in here. If it rains, what letter?
P.
P. P is the hypothesis. It's the if part. Then Emily stays inside. Q. Q is the then part, the conclusion. Okay? And then when it says she stays inside, which letter talked about her staying inside?
Q.
Q. And then it says she does not get wet. That's another conclusion, but I have to give it a different letter than Q. So that's where the R comes in. Okay, and then I go to the final conclusion, and it says, therefore, if it rains, what was the if it rains part? P. Then she doesn't get wet. So this is talking about if P happens, Q is going to happen, and if Q happens, R is going to happen. So I can just say, well, if the first thing happens, that last thing is going to happen. So if you ever see these two middle guys are the same, She stays inside. She stays inside. I can just kind of ignore them, and I can go straight from the if part, if it rains, to the last part, she doesn't get wet, and that would be my conclusion. Does this make sense to you when you think about it? Okay, then stick with me and let's just practice some more. Okay, the first two problems, all I want to do is tell which rule of logic is getting used. That's all I want to do on number 1 and 2. So number 1 says, if I take the number 10 bus, then I can get to the mall. If I can get to the mall, then I can go to the movies. Therefore, if I take the number 10 bus, then I can go to the movies. Does it make sense when you read it? Yes. Because I know if I take the number 10 bus, I can go to the mall. And if I can go to the mall, then I can go to the movies. So that means if I do the first thing, which is take the number 10 bus, then I can do the last thing, which is go to the movies. Which rule of logic is this? Yes, this is the law of syllogism. And then I can mark it up with my P's and Q's if you want to see. Do you want to see the P's and Q's?
Yes. No.
I heard a yes, so I'm gonna.
Yes.
If I take the number 10 bus, what letter? P. P's the if part, the hypothesis. Then I get to the mall. Q. Q's the then part, the conclusion. Okay, when you see I can get to the mall, which one was talking about get to the mall? Which letter? Q. As soon as I see P, Q, Q, I know it's the law of syllogism. Okay, and then it says, then I can go to the movies. That's another conclusion, but it's different than the first conclusion, so I give it a different letter, R.
I have a question.
Just a second. And then the therefore is, if I take the number 10 bus, which letter was talking about taking the number 10 bus? P. Then I can go to the movies. And which one was that? And you can see it follows the law of syllogism. If P happens, Q happens. If Q happens, R happens. That means that the first thing happens P, the last thing happens R. And just to talk about what I said a minute ago, if these two middle things are the same, then I can go straight from the if I take the number 10 bus to the last thing, I can go to the movies. A lot of people talking while I'm trying to talk. Some of you wonder why you don't understand. I don't. You have to listen. Jerry, what's your question?
If you always get a PQQ, will it always be the law of syllogism?
For what we're doing, yeah. Because I'm only teaching you these two rules, detachment and syllogism, and that's it.
All right.
Okay.
Wait, can it sometimes be PQR, or is it always PQQ?
It'll be PQQ. Okay, let's look at 2. If Amanda has eaten guacamole, then she has tasted avocado. Amanda has eaten guacamole, therefore she's tasted avocado. Good. This is the law of detachment. This was like my paper cut example, as well as the if you misbehave, you get in trouble. You misbehave, get in trouble. Okay, let me just practice marking it up real quick. If Amanda has eaten guacamole, which letter? P. Beautiful. She has tasted avocado. Q. So when I come back and I say that she's eaten guacamole, which letter is that? P. And then therefore she's tasted avocado. Q. P, Q, P, Q. Law of detachment. Okay, this one's more math related, so it's not as easy to think about. Okay, so it says, if M's the midpoint of a segment, then it divides the segment into 2 congruent segments. M's the midpoint.
That's the syllogism.
Now this one, I didn't give you a conclusion. So I need to figure out a therefore part. So, if M's the midpoint of a segment, it divides the segment into 2 congruent segments. M's the midpoint, therefore.
And is the midpoint.
Well, yeah, that's what they tell me. If M's the midpoint of a segment, then it divides the segment into 2 congruent segments.
Then M divides
M's the midpoint, therefore.
M divides
Divides
the
segment
segment
into
into 2.
Good. It divides the segment into 2 congruent segments. Okay, so I'm going to write that down, and then I can mark it up, and we'll write down what law. So it divides the segment into two congruent segments. And those three little dots mean therefore. Have you ever seen those before? What law did you think this was? It is detachment. Let's look. If M's the midpoint, what letter? P. That's the if part, the hypothesis. Then it divides the segment into two congruent segments. Which letter? Q. That's the then, the conclusion. Gentlemen. And then when I say M's the midpoint, what letter is that? P. And I know the law of detachment goes PQ, PQ. Well, this thing that I wrote, is that the Q? That's why it's the conclusion. And this is the law of detachment.
If they don't give us the last sentence, will we have to write it ourselves?
Yeah.
Are we given an assignment over this?
Good question.
I'm going to have you do a couple problems on the review like it. That's why I asked you to keep your review up. Okay, let's go to number 5. So skipping 4, let's go to 5. 5 says, if you read a good book, then you enjoy yourself. If you enjoy yourself, then your time is well spent.
Right.
Therefore, does anybody know what the conclusion would be?
You read a good book. Therefore, if you read a book.
Which one do you think this is? Detachment or syllogism? This is syllogism. If you read a good book, you enjoy yourself. If you enjoy yourself, then your time is well spent. So I can say, if the first thing happens, if I read a good book, then the last thing happens, my time is well spent. That's the conclusion. If the first thing happens, you read a good book, then the last thing happens, your time is well spent. So I'm going to write all that. So therefore, if you read a good book, then the last thing happens, your time is well spent. What did you tell me this was? Syllogism. This is the law of syllogism. I know, strange words. When I taught in Arizona, they called it the chain rule. And then when I came to Texas, it was called the law of syllogism. And I was like, what?
Yeah, we hear ours.
Okay, so do you want me to do this with the P's and Q's?
No, you're good. You're good. We're good.
Yes.
Okay. If you don't want to see it, then just blink for a while. If you read a good book, what letter? P. You enjoy yourself. Q. Okay. Now I say you enjoy yourself. Which letter is that?
Q.
Okay, that's how I know right there it's law of syllogism. P, Q, Q. And then your time is well spent. R. That's a different conclusion. And so if you looked on the front page, when that happens, P, Q, Q, R, then that means if the first thing happens, P, then the last thing happens, R, which is what we read. As long as these guys right here in the middle are the same, I can just go from the you read a good book part to the very end part. Your time is well spent. Okay, let's look at 6. If it's snowing, there's clouds in the sky.
Today it's snowing.
Today it's snowing.
I have a question.
This is the sense snowing. So there's clouds.
Yeah.
What does the R stand for?
The R is just a different conclusion.
Different letter.
Q is typically the conclusion, which is the then part. But because this is a then part, it's a conclusion, but it's not the same as that conclusion. So they needed to use a different letter, and they just picked R.
Alright.
Okay, so back to this one. If it's snowing, then there are clouds in the sky. Today it's snowing. Therefore, what would be the conclusion?
There are clouds in the sky.
Therefore, there are clouds in the sky. That's not it, Gus.
Oh my God.
Therefore, there are clouds in the sky. Yeah. So let me just do the P's and Q's for a second. If it's snowing, what letter is that? P. Then there are clouds in the sky. Q. Today it's snowing. P. So I know that this is the law of detachment. PQ, PQ. It's almost like PU, PU, but it's PQ, PQ. So if P happens, Q happens. If P happens, there it is, Q again. All right, and then let's look at this one. If a quadrilateral is a square, then it contains 4 right angles. If a quadrilateral contains 4 right angles, then it's a rectangle. Therefore, beautiful. So therefore, if a quadrilateral is a square, then it's a rectangle. Which one is this? Good. This is law of syllogism. So I can go, therefore, the very first part, if a quadrilateral is a square, the very last part, then it's a rectangle. So if a quadrilateral is a square, then it's a rectangle. And can you see that these guys here in the middle, they say the same thing?
Yep.
4 right angles, contains 4 right angles. So it's like that transitive property. So you can just go from the first thing to the last thing. Did you know this? If a quadrilateral is a square, then it's also a rectangle?
Yes.
Good. All squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. Okay, on your review, I want you to try 33 and 34. So right now, on your review, I want you to try 33 and 34. So 33 and 34 on your review. 33 and 34. Yeah.
If there wasn't a therefore statement and it just asked for the what law is, do we have to do the law? I mean, I'm not done with this is. It's just in like other things that we would have to do it.
I can't remember. That was a bag, right?
Yeah, they another geometry teacher actually had me make
Why would it not be this year?
I did so first I put
That's better.
so
Thank you.
so yeah, I'll put it up sometime before I leave today.
All right, thank you.
You'd already done.
That egg up for that guy you said, that hurt good. It's probably gonna throw it like turns every second. Like tracks up on I get that shit on the bridge around and your mouth.
That's like getting hired for a job and then asking, do I have to work? I got the job now.
I was wondering if it was like in the NFL, you can get a 40 contract, but you have to play the whole 6 years to get it. You only get like 6 years guaranteed.
Both ways around, you know, like, oh,
Like say you only get like 6 years guaranteed.
I got back on the
If you go for their 80s, if you get
I'm actually, I need a little.
Are you?
Yes, I am.
Are you good? Yeah.
Gus will help you if you need any help. I got that.
Well,
My mother lets me go to the movies. I'll be happy. I'm going to the movies.
P, which is the first part.
Kill him.
They get a kick out of that every time. Every time.
Hey. How about you say, Gus? Say kill him.
I've never even seen that video.
What? Isn't it a song? Isn't it a song? It's a
Okay,
song.
so let's talk 33. If my mother lets me go to a movie, then I'll be happy. My mom lets me go to a movie. Therefore, I'm happy. And that is detachment.
Oh my god!
Oh crap, you rocked
P, Q, P.
Can I just write log P?
I underestimated this.
Wait.
Dude, it's
Oh,
yes.
Yeah, law of detachment.
No, the ones that look complicated.
Oh, I am happy though.
Okay,
Look at them.
this one. If a man is wealthy, then he can. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't should be showing that yet. If a man is wealthy, then he buys a mansion. If he can buy a mansion, then he can hire a housekeeper. So, I say the very first thing. If a man is wealthy, to the very last thing, he can hire a housekeeper, and that's your law of syllogism.
Oh, I got one.
If these things are the same in the middle, I can go from the very first if to the very last then. Okay, then I want you guys to look at 35 for a second.
So that's two bands.
Yeah. Let's look at 35.
Exactly.
Given the true statements, all tigers